They walked into the sea, not because they wanted to, not because they had lost hope, though hope by that point had been stripped from them as surely as the clothes on their backs. They walked into the sea because a man in a uniform told them to, because refusal meant something worse. Because for 22 Australian nurses standing on a beach called Radji, on an island most of the world had never heard of, the choices had run out. It is February 16, 1942. The Pacific War is less than 10 weeks old, and already the world has changed beyond recognition. Singapore has fallen. The British Empire's greatest fortress in Asia has surrendered to a Japanese force half its size, a catastrophe so staggering that Winston Churchill would call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. 100,000. Allied troops have laid down their arms. But not everyone surrendered on Singapore Island. Thousands of civilians and military personnel had fled in the chaotic days before the fall, crammed onto whatever vessels could carry them, steaming south through the Bangka straight toward what they prayed would be safety. What waited for them on the shores of Bangka Island would become one of the most devastating war crimes of the entire Pacific conflict. And somewhere else, in the frozen plains of Manchuria, in a compound protected by barbed wire and secrecy and the absolute power of the Imperial Japanese Army, a different kind of horror was unfolding. One hidden so carefully that it would not fully come to light for decades. This is the story of two atrocities, two expressions of the same ideology of contempt, two chapters the world tried to forget. This is Bangka Island. This is Unit 731. We must go back to the beginning. In early 1942, the Australian Army Nursing Service was stretched across the Pacific. Among its most dedicated members were the nurses of the 13th Australian General Hospital, women who had volunteered knowing they would face danger, but who could not have foreseen the speed at which the Japanese advance would swallow everything in its path. Women like Sister Vivian Bullwinkel, 26 years old, red-haired, possessed of a quiet determination that those who served alongside her would later describe as almost supernatural in its steadiness. By February 1942, Singapore was untenable. On February 11th, orders came through. All nurses were to evacuate. That same day, 65 Australian nurses boarded the SS Vyner Brooke, a small British merchant vessel of just 1,600 tons. Alongside more than 200 other civilians, women, children, wounded soldiers, the ship was desperately overloaded. It had lifeboats for perhaps half its passengers. The Vyner Brooke slipped away from Singapore's Keppel Harbour as Japanese artillery was already landing in the city. The plan was to reach the Dutch East Indies, specifically Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and from there, relative safety. Little did they know that the Japanese Imperial Navy controlled these waters. The Bangka Strait, the narrow channel between Sumatra and Bangka Island, was already a killing ground. Japanese aircraft had been hunting Allied shipping for days. On the afternoon of February 14th, Valentine's Day, the Vyner Brooke was spotted. Japanese bombers attacked in 3 waves. The first bomb straddled the hull. The ship shuddered but held. The second wave found their mark. The Vyner Brooke was struck multiple times. Water poured in through shattered plates. The ship began to list immediately, dragging portside into the warm grey sea. There was no time for an orderly evacuation. People jumped. Lifeboats were lowered in chaos, some capsizing immediately. The wounded, many of whom had been brought aboard on stretchers from Singapore's collapsing hospitals, had no chance. Sister Bullwinkel was thrown into the water by the force of an explosion. She clung to wreckage, then to the edge of an overloaded lifeboat, and with extraordinary effort kept herself alive as the Vyner Brooke slipped beneath the waves. Of the roughly 265 people aboard, approximately 150 would survive the sinking. But surviving the sinking was only the beginning. Now, scattered across lifeboats and clinging to debris in shark-infested waters, they had a different problem. They were in enemy-controlled seas. And land, whatever land they found, would be Japanese land. Through the night of February 14th and into the 15th, the survivors drifted. Some boats came together. Others were separated by currents. Sister Bullwinkel found herself in a lifeboat with a small group of nurses and wounded soldiers, rowing through darkness with makeshift paddles, rationing the last of their energy against the possibility that no land would appear. By dawn on February 15th, they could see the coast of Bangka Island. It was, in a cruel irony, a beautiful place. The island's interior rose into jungle-covered hills. Its coastline was fringed with white sand. The Bangka Strait shimmered blue-green in the early morning light. Under any other circumstances, it might have seemed like paradise. The survivors made for shore in multiple groups. At a beach near a small cape called Radji Point, two separate parties landed within hours of each other, a group of civilians and soldiers and a group that included 22 Australian Army nurses. Together, their numbers reached approximately 100 survivors. They were exhausted, dehydrated, many of them wounded. They had almost no food, almost no water, and they had no weapons. By 1,000 hours on February 16th, a decision had been made. They could not survive on the beach indefinitely. Japanese patrols were known to be active throughout the island. A small party of men, British soldiers among the civilian survivors, volunteered to walk to the nearest town, Montauk, and surrender. There might be a prisoner of war camp. There would at least be water, and some semblance of the protection supposedly afforded to prisoners by the Geneva Convention. The men left. The nurses waited. What the men encountered in Montauk was not reassuring. Japanese troops had occupied the island completely. The port was under military control. Civilian prisoners were being processed and moved. The soldiers were taken captive, their fate uncertain. Back on Radji Beach, the nurses had no way of knowing this. They tended to the wounded as best they could, used what little medical supplies had survived the sinking, and waited in the heat of a Sumatran February. By 1200 hours, Japanese soldiers appeared on the beach. A small patrol, accounts vary between 12 and 20 soldiers, emerged from the tree line. They were armed. Their officer surveyed the survivors on the beach with the flat, expressionless calculation of a man doing a job. The nurses, following standard military protocol, identified themselves clearly. They were non-combatants. They were medical personnel. They bore the Red Cross insignia. Under international law, under any interpretation of the laws of war, they should have been protected. The laws of war did not apply on Radji Beach. What happened next proceeded in stages, each one a descent into something that those who study the Pacific War still struggle to fully process. The Japanese officer separated the survivors. The wounded men, approximately 22 of them, soldiers unable to walk, were taken around a rocky promontory out of sight of the nurses. Moments later, the sound of screaming reached across the sand, then silence. The nurses stood together on the beach. The Japanese soldiers turned toward them. The officer gave an order. The nurses were told to walk into the sea. Sister Vivian Bullwinkel would later describe the moment in testimony that remained consistent across decades of recounting, never embellished, never dramatized, always delivered in the same quiet, measured voice that somehow made the horror of it more complete rather than less. They walked into the sea together, all 22 of them. Some held hands. The water rose to their knees, to their waists. The soldiers opened fire. Bullwinkel felt a bullet enter her left side. It passed through her, between her hip and her lower ribs. She fell forward. The cold water closed over her. She lay still. The soldiers, believing all 22 nurses dead, turned and left the beach. Sister Vivian Bullwinkel did not die on Radji Beach. After an unknown amount of time, she later estimated perhaps 10 minutes, she came to consciousness in the shallows. She dragged herself up onto the sand. She was bleeding. She was alone. Around her, the bodies of her colleagues lay in the water. 21 women. 21 nurses who had volunteered to serve, who had fled Singapore to save their lives, who had survived the sinking of the Vyner Brooke, who had clung to hope through a night in shark-infested waters. All dead. Bullwinkel crawled into the jungle at the edge of the beach and collapsed. For the next 12 days, she survived alone in the Sumatran jungle, wounded, without medical supplies, eating whatever she could find. A bullet had passed clean through her body without striking any vital organ. The wound was serious, but she had the training, the will, and what she would later attribute simply to luck, to keep it from killing her. On approximately the 28th of February, she encountered Private Cecil Kingsley, a British soldier who had also survived the massacre on the beach. Kingsley was in far worse condition. Together they made their way out of the jungle and surrendered to Japanese authorities in Montauk. They were taken to a civilian internment camp. And here, the second phase of Vivian Bullwinkel's ordeal began, because she was now a prisoner of the Imperial Japanese Army, and she understood, with absolute clarity, what she had witnessed. She understood that if she told the wrong person what had happened on Radji Beach, she might not survive the war. She kept silent for 3.5 years, through internment at Palembang, through the brutality of POW camp conditions, the starvation, the disease, the dysentery that killed so many of her fellow prisoners. She watched women die around her from illnesses that should have been treatable, from malnutrition that should never have occurred, from a calculated program of neglect that was itself a war crime. She said nothing about the beach. She kept her own counsel. She survived. Now we must turn to another darkness, one that operated with clinical precision rather than sudden brutality, one that was, in its own way, more calculated and more deliberate than anything that happened on Radji Beach. In 1936, in the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a military unit was established under the command of Lieutenant General Shi Ishii. It was given the deliberately mundane designation Unit 731. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Officially, its purpose was to protect Japanese soldiers from disease. Unit 731 was a biological and chemical weapons research facility, and its research was conducted on human beings. The compound at Pingfang, built between 1936 and 1939, covered more than 6 square kilometers. It included laboratories, test chambers, a crematorium, and barracks for the researchers. It employed at its peak more than 3,000 Japanese military personnel and scientists. It also held at any given time between 400 and 600 prisoners, Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean detainees, and, as the war expanded, some Allied prisoners of war. The prisoners were given a name. They were called marutas. The word means logs. They were not treated as human beings. They were treated as experimental subjects. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 tested the limits of what the human body could endure. Researchers deliberately infected prisoners with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other diseases, then studied the progression of illness without administering treatment. Prisoners were subjected to frostbite experiments, limbs immersed in freezing water until the flesh froze solid, then subjected to various thawing methods to observe tissue damage. Prisoners were subjected to vivisection surgery conducted without anesthetic, sometimes to study the effects of a disease on internal organs in real time. These were not rogue acts. They were not the work of a few deranged individuals operating outside the knowledge of the command structure. They were sanctioned, documented, and reported upward through the chain of command. The data was published with the human origin of the experimental subjects concealed in medical journals. Some of it is still cited today, a fact that continues to generate profound ethical controversy in the medical community. The scale of the killing at Unit 731 is difficult to establish with precision, because many of the records were deliberately destroyed in the final days of the war. Estimates of the number of people killed in the Pingfang facility alone range from 3,000 to more than 10,000, when the activities of Unit 731's affiliated units across China are included. Some historians place the total death toll from the program in the hundreds of thousands. The war ended on August 10, 1945. Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. Emperor Hirohito's radio address brought the fighting to a stop. But the end of the fighting did not mean the revelation of what had been hidden. In the final days before the surrender, General Shi Ishii issued orders to destroy the Pingfang facility. Buildings were demolished, records were burned. The remaining prisoners, those who had not already been killed in the final months of the war, were murdered to eliminate witnesses. Issei himself fled to Japan, living under a false name for a period before eventually being located by American occupation authorities. What happened next represents one of the most morally complex decisions of the post-war era. The United States, through the Far Eastern Command under General Douglas MacArthur, made a decision. The biological weapons data accumulated by Unit 731 data obtained through the systematic murder and torture of thousands of human beings was of significant military and scientific interest. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was a potential adversary. Biological weapons research was strategically valuable. The decision was made to grant immunity from prosecution to Sher Eshi and the senior personnel of Unit 731, in exchange for their complete cooperation in transferring all research data to American military authorities. No member of Unit 731's leadership was ever prosecuted for war crimes. Shirishie died in Tokyo in 1959 of throat cancer, a free man. Several of his subordinates went on to distinguished careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and industry. The data they produced, data written in the suffering of thousands of men, women, and children, was classified by the United States government and did not begin to be declassified until the 1990s. The story of Unit 731 was suppressed not through Japanese secrecy alone, but through the active collaboration of the nation that had won the war. Meanwhile, in a civilian internment camp in Sumatra, Vivian Bullwinkel was preparing for her own reckoning with history. When the war ended in August 1945, the surviving prisoners were liberated. Bullwinkel was among them, one of only 24 of the 65 Australian nurses who had evacuated Singapore to survive the entire war. She was alive. She was finally able to speak. In October 1945, she gave her first formal testimony about the massacre on Radji Beach. She would go on to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes trials in 1947. Her testimony was clear, detailed, and unshakable. She described the order to walk into the sea. She described the sound of the gunfire. She described coming to consciousness in the shallows, surrounded by the bodies of her colleagues. The massacre was formally recorded. The evidence was entered into the trial record. But here too the limits of post-war justice were exposed. No individual, Japanese soldier or officer was ever specifically tried and convicted for the massacre on Radji Beach. The chain of command was too fractured. The witnesses too few. The perpetrators too well hidden within the broader machinery of the Japanese military. Justice for Radji Beach never fully came. Vivian Bullwinkel returned to Australia. She continued her nursing career, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. She became the founding president of the Australian College of Nursing. She spent decades advocating for the recognition of her colleagues, for the 21 women who had died on that beach, and for the thousands of nurses who had served in conditions that the civilian world had never fully understood or acknowledged. In 1993, a bronze statue of Vivian Bullwinkel was unveiled in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. She was present at the unveiling. She was 77 years old. She died in 2000 at the age of 84. The bullet wound she had sustained on Radji Beach had, in a physical sense, healed long ago. Whether the wound left by 58 years of carrying the knowledge of what she had survived ever fully healed is a question only she could have answered. The full accounting of Unit 731's crimes began, haltingly, in the late 20th century, in 1989. Construction workers in Tokyo unearthed human remains near the site of a former Army Medical College, remains that were later confirmed to be consistent with experimental subjects. The Japanese government acknowledged the discovery but was slow to act on its implications. In the 1990s and 2000s, a series of civil lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts by survivors and the families of victims of Unit 731's experiments. In 2002, the Tokyo High Court acknowledged that the Japanese military had conducted biological warfare experiments on human subjects, but ruled that the plaintiffs were not entitled to compensation under Japanese law, and that the government bore no legal obligation to provide it. No member of Unit 731 in Japan or elsewhere was ever convicted of a war crime related to the unit's activities. The data agreement between the United States and Unit 731's leadership remains one of the most contested ethical decisions in the history of post-war intelligence. Critics argue with considerable force that accepting data obtained through torture and murder made the United States complicit in those crimes, and that the immunity deal represented a fundamental betrayal of the Nuremberg principles that the same United States had helped establish. The scale of what Unit 731 accomplished, if that word can be used for something so horrifying, was not trivial. The unit developed delivery systems for biological agents, including plague-infected fleas that were deployed against Chinese cities. These field operations killed tens of thousands of civilians. The plague outbreaks they triggered, by some estimates, continued to kill people for years after the weapons were deployed. The victims of Radji Beach have a memorial. It stands near the site of the massacre on Bangka Island, in what is now Indonesia. It lists the names of the 21 nurses who were killed. It faces the sea. The victims of Unit 731 have a museum. The site of the Pingfang compound was preserved and opened to the public in 1985 as the Unit 731 Crime Evidence Museum. Each year, hundreds of thousands of visitors walk through its exhibits. They see the test chambers. They read the documented accounts of what was done to human beings in those rooms. The museum exists because the victims of Unit 731 were Chinese, Soviet and Korean peoples whose governments had reason to ensure that what was done to them was remembered. The victims of Radji Beach were Australian, citizens of a nation that has sometimes been slow to confront the darkest chapters of its wartime history, but that has, ultimately, enshrined the memory of those 22 women in its national memory. Both sets of victims deserved justice. Neither received it fully. The history of the Second World War is not a simple story of evil defeated and good triumphant. It is a more complicated history, one in which genuine heroism coexisted with genuine atrocity, in which the victors made moral compromises that still cast shadows, in which the voices of the victims were sometimes raised and sometimes silenced, depending on the convenience of those with the power to listen. Vivian Bullwinkel walked into the sea because she was told to. She walked back out because something in her, call it will, call it luck, call it the inscrutable randomness of where a bullet passes through a body, refused to let her die. She spent the rest of her long life making sure the world knew what had happened to the 21 women who did not walk out with her. That, at least, was a battle she won. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WW2 Vault as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.